I said, Don, what do you want? What do you need? He said, I want you to come to Grand Valley and direct our charter schools program. He said, I'm a friend of the governor, and it's been 2 years. We've been trying to get a charter, but we don't have any. I said, well, I'll consider it.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom. Powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Welcome, friends. We are here again on the Bold by Choice podcast. I'm your host, Vashanta Harris, and in our last episode, we explored the people and the politics behind the passage of charter laws across a few different states. What those stories revealed beyond the headlines was just how much courage and creativity it took to turn a bold idea into law. But passing a law is only the beginning. Once a charter law exists, someone has to make it real. And that's what today's episode is all about. Right, Jim?
Indeed. We call those authorizers. And I gave a good portion of my life to trying to figure out what that meant. I began at Central Michigan University in an office of the boss and me and an assistant. And we worked with school founders that were trying to get charter contracts, and the university was the authorizer. And so that was a great experience. And then I had the privilege of also helping found the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. And so between those experiences and working across the country now with authorizers as the National Charter School Institute, hopefully I've learned a thing or two that I can share with our audience.
That's awesome. So we talked about someone, right? Some entity has to make chartering real. And that someone became known as the authorizer. But in the early days, there was not a clear blueprint for that role. In fact, the word authorizer wasn't widely used yet. People just knew that someone had to say yes to say enough, right? Today, we have a definition that I'd like to share. This definition is used by the National Association for Charter School Authorizers, and it goes like this. What do charter authorizers do? Charter school authorizers oversee charter schools. Charter schools are public schools that are granted more autonomy than traditional district schools to be innovative in curriculum, operations, and management. In exchange for greater autonomy, charter schools are subject to greater accountability. They must not only meet certain criteria required of all the public schools, but must also meet the goals specified within each charter contract. So charter school authorizers play a critical role in every aspect of the life cycle of charter schools. Authorizers decide which new school proposals to approve, they monitor each school's operations, and decide which schools are meeting the performance standards that are required to stay open. Authorizers should maintain high standards for schools, uphold school autonomy, and protect student and public interests. And so, Don and Jim, in those early days, there wasn't yet a clear description for the job and the role of an authorizer. Why was this role commonly misunderstood back in the early 1990s?
Vashanta, that's what the book says. And when these laws were first getting off the ground, little thought had been given to authorizing and authorizers. And so what it really was about was can-do people that took a leadership role and said, we got to figure out how to implement this law. And I want to bring Don in because he's got a lot of thoughts on this and some great research. And it really gets down fundamentally to there's policy, ideas, and then there's implementation. And thinking out the how is so critical.
Yeah, in implementation, Vashanta, is where a lot of laws and a lot of policies start falling apart because there are so many what you'd call veto points in it. It's very easy for a legislature to enact a law and then task an agency to do something. And if the folks within that agency don't have the right resources, the right will, it's not fitting with the agency's mission, the entire thing can fall apart in a hurry. So back to your question about why the job of the authorizer was misunderstood. Well, if you go back to some of the first charter laws, authorizing wasn't really thought about in them. So we see in some Val Shanker's early work on this, he thought of an authorizer as, quote, some official agency, end quote, that would grant a charter. Other writers like John Chubb and Terry Moe talked about groups getting a charter from quote unquote the state. Both of those are pretty big nebulous entities. So the founders, the framers of charter laws were really thinking a lot about the schools, what the schools were going to do for kids, how the schools would be organized and the school's powers, but not a lot about the mechanisms of how the school gets into existence or who's responsible at the state or local level for doing that. And that left the role of the authorizer fairly well undefined. And required a lot of great people over time to really shape that and bring that to life to be able to open up new schools for kids.
That's right. And I think about this like from a leadership standpoint. What do you all both say it takes to lead when your role isn't yet defined?
Again, that's a great question, and I think it comes down to two components. The first is will. Is this something that your heart's in, that you believe in, that's consistent with your mission? Do you want to do it? And if the answer is yes, implementation becomes a lot easier because you know your purpose, you're aligned, you know your vision behind it. And the second is, do you have the right capacity and resources to do it? And for a lot of authorizers, what we'll hear today is a lot of authorizers started out with zero. So in order to get that capacity requires a lot of negotiations, bargaining within your agency, bargaining with others, trying to convince other people to come on board with you. So you've really got to assemble the apparatus, if you will, necessary to receive charter applications, to review them, to oversee the schools, and to make high stakes decisions. And that all comes back to that will component. If you're not interested in doing the work, it's easy to not develop the capacity. If you are interested in doing the work, the capacity becomes, a necessity that you put together.
To paraphrase Don, you got to have the will and you got to have the capacity. But I'm going to go back. You got to be a little crazy. In fact, in those early days, you had to be a lot crazy. And the reason is this was something new. It was being contested politically, legally, constitutionally, in the media. This wasn't a position you took to win friends, to gain popularity. You had to be a bit crazy. And you also had to believe in the impossible because you were pushing the rock up the hill. But you had to believe. If you didn't believe that there was a better way to educate kids, to do things differently for educators and for families, this wasn't the job for you. And so will and capacity are important, but you're also a little crazy and a big belief that we could do things better.
Yeah, and on that belief side, Vashanta, I think a lot of the early laws tasked districts with authorizing because it made conceptual sense. You know, they're doing school work already. They're out there. They've got a board. They've got an apparatus. But districts have a way of doing things. They have a model. They have an approach. They have a system of beliefs already. So I think that's what we're going to see in some of these examples that we're going through about why looking at alternative forms is really important to get those folks who are just a little crazy engaged within chartering.
And Vashana, I'm going to press Don a little bit on that. Did people really think districts would make great authorizers, or was that all we knew? And so it was the easy place to go.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways you're right, Jim. It was kind of the default assumption.
And I'll take that back to, Ray Buddy. He talked about districts doing it. Well, that's all we knew, right? Coldry comes along and says somebody besides the district. And that's part of the policy innovation that we'll dig into.
And that's a great segue for us to travel to the District of Columbia. So let's meet a couple of our superstars.
Do that for Washington, D.C., and that's why I'm so glad to welcome our guests today. Let me give you some background. Josephine Baker, she led the charter school sector in D.C. from 1997 to 2011. She was a founding member of the D.C. Public Charter School Board. She was elected as its first chair and later served as executive director. Her work in D.C. became known as an authorizer model nationally and internationally. At the national level, she was also a founding member and chair of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, known as NACSA. And she's a member of the Charter Schools Hall of Fame. What is a little surprising about her background is that Josephine Baker is a teacher who came out of the DC public schools. And she was a beloved award-winning teacher who taught generations of students. So she was a perfect person to lead chartering into Washington, D.C. Now, what's ironic is that along the way, Joe Baker became executive director of the D.C. Public Charter School Board, and they needed another chair. And that chair happened to be someone by the name of Tom Nida. He was appointed to the PCSB, as we call it, in 2003 and was chair from 2004 to 2010. Now, Tom Nida is a banker, and in his banking career of over 50 years, he has helped hundreds and hundreds of charter schools to either develop their facilities or to renovate them. Nida was a trailblazer in charter school lending, was one of the first bank lenders to charter schools, and he was recognized nationally for his expertise. And he lent that financial expertise, which is so important to the success of charter schools, to the board by developing a model system and ranking the financial benchmarks to evaluate just how financially sound the charter school was. This system, branded as the Financial GPA, became a model for financial accountability for other charter school founders around the nation. Tom Nida also chaired, until yesterday, the Charter Schools Development Corporation Board of Directors. As full disclosure, I'm vice chair of that board and have had the opportunity to work with Tom for many years and have seen him in action. So I can't think of two better people to be interviewing on the 30th anniversary of charter schools. Welcome, both of you.
Now that we've been introduced to our featured guests, we're going to move over to understanding exactly what it took from them in DC to begin to craft the role of authorizing. Let's take a listen.
In terms of the success of schools.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the issue was that it was critically important that the authorizer, in this case the DC Public Charter School Board, was looking at three basic elements continuously. Obviously, academic performance was uppermost in everybody's mind. But right behind it was financial performance and the effectiveness or lack thereof of governance. You need to have all three. Now, the bankers can follow the money, the financial side. But we were more dependent on what sort of evaluation the board as the authorizer was giving for those academic measures and for the governance measures they put in place. And so it became critically necessary to have a good working relationship between the board and the financial community to get the financial community comfortable, because the biggest need for charter schools for financing is to get a facility. And school facilities are special purpose facilities, which generally is tough to finance anyway. The other part of it is, as DC's economy was rebounding, real estate costs in DC continued to escalate far beyond these facility allowance limitations that were there. And so if I'm a banker and I've got a school that Joe Baker's board had given a 15-year charter, and I'm thinking, well, I can't do a 2-year facility deal. It's going to be long-term too. So I need, if I'm going to make a decision as a banker to finance a school for the long term, I've got to have some sense that this authorizer is going to be there to look out for that school for the long term. And that if something starts to go a little off the rails, they're going to intervene, actively and positively, so that in doing so, that protects my interest as a financer of these facilities.
And you developed a tool along those lines. Talk about that.
Well, and working with Joe and others in the field and individual schools, I realized I needed to have something I could put my hands around to create a set of metrics that would help me look at things, not only the typical financial performance that comes out of financial statements, but looking at things like, so how does this board evaluate their academic success? What are the trends in their attendance levels? What are the trends in their recruitment levels? What's their teacher turnover level? Things that you don't think about as a banker normally, but clearly you think about as an educator. And all of these types of measurements then looking at how do I grade these? What's real success?
But the point was you had them because
Yes.
we were collecting them.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so she was my resource for putting this stuff together. And then since this had an educational flavor, I figured, well, let's just call it GPI. Although in this case, it stood for General Performance Assessment as opposed to grade point average. But it was a 4-point scale, just like a report card. And so I made the metric that said you had to have at least a C grade to be acceptable to the bank, 2.5 or better. And if you actually got into the 3 where you're going to be on Dean's List, honor roll, whatever, then we'd probably cut you a better deal than we might have. But on the other hand, if you were C- and going downhill toward D and F, it's like not so fast. And, a lot of this stuff ended up over time kind of evolving as a natural expansion of this concept into what that became the performance management framework, which is now the tool that folks use to evaluate, how schools are doing overall.
And that was so important to facilities. It was also very important to us in terms of evaluating our schools. And of course, I tell anyone from year one to year 2, maybe 10 years later, nationally, we were talking about looking at students' performance over time. We did that from year 1. I still have the documents or the booklet that we published of the schools that we had that showed all students who were in this school in this year who were now tested in the next year. And it wasn't just testing, but testing was a part of it. What kind of progress did they make? And like I said, 10 years later, the nation got all excited about following the children. Well, we did that from year 1 because it was important to understand whether our schools were serving children well. That's the whole point of this whole exercise, is to make sure that we serve children well. So again, we had a publication that we put out, which I still have, I think I sent to you, that actually showed the things that we tried to measure, or that we did measure, that told us that students who were here last year made a certain amount of progress. Don't expect it to do 2 or 3 grade levels overnight, but we need to see some progress. And certainly then the next year, the school should have even more influence. Maybe if you have little the first year, certainly the next year. So you have that continuum. And that's how you measure success. You don't measure it from one year and assume that this year is a great year. We've got to see that progress is continuous.
Yeah, and actually that continuous progress also posed a different kind of challenge, because there was the temptation for some charter schools that enjoyed early success to expand sometimes beyond their capacities to sustain that excellence. And so what many charter school operators, managers, leaders did not initially recognize is you can grow too fast. And what happens is, if you open up your door to a whole bunch of new kids that do not know your school's environment, its culture, its traditions, and all that, you're looking to take a huge step backwards in terms of the academic results, which will impact the financial results, which will probably put stress on the governance and all that. And so we became aware over time that the really successful schools were going to have to learn how to grow incrementally under a long-term plan, not just simply growing for the sake of growing. That, I must be a good school because I'm now bigger than everybody else. No, that wasn't the benchmark.
No, and the board, along with the bankers, clearly cooperated. I mean, we gave them the information, and we did not let a school automatically. They had to come to us for permission to add a grade. I mean, it wasn't in their original contract. And if it was, sometimes you would suggest that maybe they didn't want to yet add that next grade because they were having some problems with the students that they had. But this is the kind of oversight that makes the difference between whether your schools, it doesn't mean that they can't do the job. It just means that they need the support system to get the job done.
And I think the schools that ultimately became the most successful were the ones that learned how to really work the system to their advantage. And the way you do that is you have an ongoing open, honest dialogue between the school leadership, the authorizer board, and the lender. Because what the board didn't need was a lender to get upset about finances and foreclose and put a bunch of kids out on the street. What the bank didn't need was for the board to do that, and all of a sudden we got an empty building. And so there was this collaboration that involved both the public sector from the standpoint of the charter board and the school, and the private sector, which was the lenders involved.
And when you talk about putting kids out on the street, I'm thinking of the fact that charters boards in general have had a great deal of trouble in psychologically in closing schools, and that was an issue I know for a number of years. But it's a sin to not close them if they're not doing the job that needs to be done. And so, yeah, but if you have a process, a system, if you are looking year to year at the progress of students and that they are being well served, that the finances are in good shape, all of that, then you move them along. If not, you put them on probation and they get a couple of years to fix it or to show that they're fixing it, or if they aren't fixing it. And then, of course, now that the process has been, just about the time I left, we developed an even more precise process about how to evaluate the progress of schools. So, but the authorizer's job, and NACSA has laid it out in many, many different ways. National Association of Charter School Authorizers. I hate acronyms because often people don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, they have many, many tools to help authorizers provide the oversight that is needed. And that flows down to the schools as well, because everybody needs help. The authorizer needs help. The schools need help. The community needs help. And the only way you really make this work is that everybody is on the same page and doing the kinds of things that are supported.
So I love this particular section, Don, as Joe Baker and Tom Nida really start to talk about the elements that made up what the authorizing body was responsible for. So I want to start there. What are the elements that we've heard here and that are popular with authorizers today?
Sure, and there are a lot of things that Joe and Tom and the early pioneers put in place that we still have today. Part of it is, the need to monitor in a robust way, a robust and transparent way, the academic, financial, and governance performance of the school, because, as Tom said, you really need all three working in tandem. And you need clear lines of communications between all parties, because if the lenders start losing confidence in what you're doing, that's problematic from the facility side. If management is not delivering great results for kids, that's problematic. And the authorizer needs to have systems and procedures in place to understand what's going on, to be able to make high stakes decisions like whether to give the school a little more time to turn around, different interventions, or in some instances, closure. But one thing I want to draw attention to beyond the technical side of what Tom and Joe were talking about was the relationships and the values. What Joe and Tom were really talking about is the authorizer is a steward of the public trust in this instance. And when an authorizer grants a charter contract, it's doing so to a group of people that it believes has the ability to run a great school for kids in a financially sound way, in accordance with all the things that we think of is going along with stewarding taxpayer dollars well. And if that's not happening, the authorizer is the one that intervenes, develops the relationships, the lines of communication, stewards the values, intervenes either in a positive or a negative way, allows the school to grow and flourish, or maybe take some corrective action. But without that focus on values that I think underpinned Joe and Tom's conversation, none of that really happens.
Amen. Josephine Baker, we all call her Joe, Tom Nida, they're not just legends and pioneers and blazed the trails in DC. They're friends and colleagues. And Joe serves on the National Charter School Founders Library Advisory Board still to this day. And Tom is still on 22 Beacon, which is the new brand of the Charter School Development Corporation. But his commitment to facilities and financing and making chartering work better for kids is still there. And the reason I want to emphasize that is, to Don's point, these are people that believed and cared that there was a better way. And they just didn't serve for a time. They've stayed at this their whole lives because they saw that this was a better way. I also want to point out something. A lot of times today we talk about academics, finance, and operations. But if you listen closely to Tom, he said academics, finance, and governance. And I really want to emphasize governance because there's a lot in the charter world that have given short shrift to the importance of boards. They're volunteers, they're sometimes frustrating, not prepared, not knowledgeable, etc. But they are key. And that's why the governing boards are such an important part of our work at the National Charter Schools Institute. We call it governing for greatness. But those board members in many states swear an oath of office. And they have a duty and a responsibility to govern these public schools and to serve the public trust. And so we often throw out a riddle: who's the first line of public oversight and accountability? And lots of times people say authorizers. And we smile and say, no, it's the local charter public school board. And the authorizers do have an important role. But that's where the board governance and the authorizing working in tandem really is a powerful force. The last thing I'll say is how simple they made it sound. And what I mean by that is they kept the main thing the main thing. What you heard Joe say is, are the schools serving kids well? Now, we've fancied that up in lots of different ways of metrics and analysis and visits and qualitative and quantitative. But the core question is, are the schools serving children well? And how do you evaluate that progress? And you heard that they really worked on an annual evaluation progress. And if you weren't making progress, they didn't just say, oh, well, they said, hey, we better talk. We better find a way that you can get better. Do you want to get better? Do you have the capacity to get better? How fast can you get better? And so they were what we today would call ecosystems builders. You heard Tom say the greatest thing was an open, honest dialogue between the school, the authorizer, the lender. They knew and they pioneered a lot of the work that just said, you know what, this isn't just about authorizers and schools, it's about the ecosystem. How do we make it work for everybody's interests, but most importantly, the students?
That's right. At the end of the clip, you hear Joe Baker say, well, everybody needs help. The schools need help. The authorizers need help. The boards need help. How do you two see this kind of wrestling authorizers have with the duality of providing support, but also maintaining accountability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to, just kind of frame up what accountability is, because it's a word we use an awful lot in the education space. And I like to think of accountability is doing what you said you were going to do. If you did not, accepting responsibility for it and making it right. Okay. So when an authorizer is engaged in quote unquote accountability, the authorizer is evaluating the school as a friend and a supporter in a lot of ways of, did you do what you said you were going to do? And if not, how do we work together to make it right? Because we have a shared interest in the success for kids. It comes back to the public values and the stewardship of what the public wants to see in education. And that's great schools for kids. So on the accountability side, yes, there's a tension in some ways, because in providing oversight, you don't want to become too close to a school in some ways, because you don't want to lose your objectivity on the results that the school is achieving for kids. But at the same time, authorizers need to approach the work with compassion, with friendship, with their heart in it for kids, to recognize and understand that we all have a stake in this and we all want to do better for kids over time.
Vashonda, when I put my old authorizer hat on, I wanted the schools to be successful because I didn't want the consequences that came if they weren't. And that's not just looking at it from a work standpoint, but the consequences to students, to parents, to families. A school that doesn't work is disruptive. And we all want the best for kids. And so that's just super important. But I want to pick something out Joe Baker said at the end. Are we all on the same page, right? Are we all on the same page? We tried to add a few things to what does it mean to be on the same page between schools, boards, and authorizers. And we said, it really means that we have a shared vision, that we have some shared values, that we have relationships of mutual trust and respect that lead to what Tom said, that open, honest dialogue. And there's clear expectations. Nobody wants to be surprised. And so when you can get those three things working, you're on the same page and you're going to win more for kids.
Yeah, and Vashanta, to that point, the shared values is where it starts. Because if an authorizer does not have clarity in what it's trying to accomplish and why it was granted authorizing authority to do great things for kids with new schools, and can't convey and help applicants align their values to the authorizers, you're just getting off on the wrong foot. And if an authorizer and its schools do not share the same values, if they're not on the same page, the relationship I found is almost impossible to move forward with in a way that gets great results for kids and protects taxpayer interests. So it's just so critical to think of these issues up front and to have the conversations with applicants that go beyond what's on the page, beyond the technical, to understand why they're involved in chartering, what they want to accomplish for kids, how everybody can work together for that, and share in a success for students. That's just irreplaceable and essential at the start. And that's why I think authorizing is just deeper than the technical. It's about how do we steward the possibilities that we can have for the future.
And Vashanta, that is so important because we have been trying to call people to be bold by choice. And what we're saying is charters isn't just a law. It isn't just a process. Chartering is a promise, and it's a promise we prove together.
That's right. And Dawn, we're going to come to your neck of the woods with our next friend and colleague. We're going to hear a little bit from Pat Sandro. And if I have it correct, Mr. Sandro was the first director of the charter schools office at Grand Valley State University. Do I have that factual?
That's right. He set the path for the rest of us at GVSU.
And what's super cool, and we're going to hear from him, is that there's a little bit of different mindset. So as we talk about how authorizing began to develop across the states, we have a few different examples. So we're going to hear from Pat himself. Let's take a listen.
Well, I was the superintendent of the Grand Rapids Public Schools. We had 34,000 students, 2,000 teachers, $210 million budget. But after I solved the problems with staff, I retired after 4 years. And I started investing in real estate. But I got a call from Don Lubbers, and he asked me to play golf with him. He said he wanted to talk to me. And I went out, and after 9 holes, we hadn't had a question from him. And I said, Don, what do you want? What do you need? He said, I want you to come to Grand Valley and direct our charter schools program. He said, I'm a friend of the governor, and it's been 2 years. We've been trying to get a charter, but we don't have any. I said, well, I'll consider it. And he said, no, I want you to do it. I said, well, Don, I don't think I can. He said, why not? And I said, well, because I'll lose my friends. And he couldn't believe it. And he said immediately, Pat, if you lose a friend helping a child get an education, which you're in, you don't have friends. I said, whoa. I said, I hadn't given that one a thought.
Yeah.
I'll call you tomorrow. So I went to 2 friends that I could trust for truth. And you don't always get the truth when you're a superintendent. And they both discouraged me, one of them violently.
Okay.
And I said, well, thanks, Dan. I said, I needed that advice. And I called Don back. I said, where do you want me in the morning? And he said, you come out. He said, I'll give you an office.
So what about that conversation changed your mind to get you into the charter space?
Well, I had read this legislation, and I had most of my problems in Grand Rapids were with the 9 unions that I had. And I'd spend a whole day with them, and I'd go home with a headache. And they were really dictating things for teachers.
Sure.
And I just thought about it, and I thought about the potential freedom that a charter would have. You could name your own board members.
Sure.
You could give the school part of the state aid, which you got. We did that. And Grand Valley's board was really interested in this. And I thought, this is a chance to do something really unique. And it turned out to be exactly true.
So when you came to Grand Valley, before any of the schools were opened, what were some of your thoughts during that first year, helping get the schools launched?
Well, in the first year, I wasn't liked by the faculty because they were all from the traditional union schools. They wouldn't talk to me. But I was meeting people when I looked at their applications that were really innovative. I got to know them, and I picked the 6 best.
Okay.
And I took that to the board and asked for their approval. And the next day, the headline in the Grand Rapids Press was Grand Valley charters 6 schools, which was a shot heard around the state.
Sure.
Now, all of a sudden, I'm on everybody's speaker bureau. And I'm telling them the truth.
Yeah.
So I like this clip because, in my view, Pat Sandro's mindset was really key in how the authorizing space, particularly at Grand Valley, was being designed. Don, can you share a little bit about just the mindset and how the authorizing work began at Grand Valley?
Yeah, Pat was very kid first on authorizing, and that's an extension of the university's values. So one person you heard Pat mention was Don Lubbers, who was the president of Grand Valley at the time. President Lubbers served as president from 1969 to 2001. So he really built the institution into what it is today. And he did that by always having a student-first approach, family-first approach on things, making the university a welcoming environment and an entrepreneurial environment for faculty and others who just wanted to do things differently. So chartering was really a natural extension of the university's mission. And if Pat were here today, he'd tell you that in chartering, he looked beyond the regulatory. Yes, that had to be done. Yes, there had to be a charter contract. The university would support the boards, provide oversight and accountability to make sure the academics were in a good spot. But when a school would stumble, Pat's goal was to put his arm around them and walk with them and help them get better. And that meant, in some ways, marshaling the resources that a big university has, and in some ways, just marshaling the creativity and innovation inherent within the charter sector. So for us at Grand Valley, he really set the path that my successor, Leah, and her team are still on today and still doing great things for kids. And I think he was just a model for what university authorizers can do in that space. But more important than what I think about Pat is what Jim thinks about Pat, because the two of them got to work together in the early years. Jim, as I think folks know, was a GVSU alum. So even though he spent most of his career at Central Michigan, I know there's still a soft spot in his heart for the Lakers. So Jim, what was it like working with Pat in those early days?
The best thing about Pat is the greatest stories I can't tell, not even on a Bold by Choice podcast. But I'll tell you, you heard Pat. Pat is a gentleman who I got to work closely with. We were counterparts. As Don said, I was at Central Michigan University. He was at Grand Valley State. But Pat brought so much credibility because he was the former superintendent of Grand Rapids Public Schools, the second largest district in the state of Michigan at the time. And he was a stand-up guy. He had a great network. He had great knowledge, very serious, very thoughtful. But you also could hear in that clip, very firm, very resolute. Like, he was well-studied, well-educated. He knew what truth was and what it wasn't, and he chose to stand on the side of truth. But one of the things that Pat brought to it was he brought another university, because Central Michigan University had been the first, and we were getting a lot of criticism. And so to have Grand Valley and then Eastern Michigan and then Saginaw Valley were the first 4 at the time, it brought credibility to the work. It brought others that could share the burden. And it also gave us people to collaborate with, think with, plan with, do with. And so Pat was just so important in Michigan's charter school movement and its evolution.
Yeah. And when I think about it, we're in D.C. We're talking about the D.C. Public Charter School Board, right? So in some sense, a statewide authorizer. Pat's history came from a district, and we know today we do have some districts that also serve as authorizers. And then we have the higher education institutions. And so what we're seeing is there are different bodies that are getting into this work. Can the two of you unpack, like, what does that look like today?
Yeah, that's right. That we're different bodies getting into the work. And one commonality between Pat and Joe Baker is that they both came out of the traditional district setting. So, as many authorizers today did as well, started out as teachers and advanced into different capacities. So, both of them are people that got into this because they wanted to help kids and wanted to help kids through new and innovative ways, not because they didn't like the teachers, not because they wanted to take down the district. They were fans of the district, fans of the teachers, and all the great things that they did. It was about the innovation and about the possibilities that it provided. And I think that an innovative university is well positioned to do that, as are districts that think differently about it, as are independent bodies. So in a lot of ways, it gets back to that will and that passion to want to do something better for kids and create new opportunities.
So, Rashawn, I'm going to come at this one hard in a bold by choice way. But charters are, if you go to the textbook, it says they're freed from all the rules in exchange for accountability. Most of us that work in this world know that's just not true. But I'm going to frame it in a different way. And you heard it in Pat. He said, charters have an opportunity to have appointed boards. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, he worked for an elected board. Elected boards, and anybody that's worked for them know it comes with a good dose of politics, a good dose of personalities, and a good dose of frustration. And so here's a experienced, successful superintendent. He said he's got a headache. Well, why else did he have a headache? Well, he had to spend a day with 9 unions, and they dictated. So a leader that wants to move an organization forward, if they feel like their board is making it hard for them and they feel like their union relationships are making it hard, well, it's not that the charter law doesn't say you don't have a board or that you don't have a union. What it says is you got a free start and you can tackle these things a bit differently. And that doesn't mean you're freed from, quote, all the rules and regulations. It's that you're able to take some of the things that we just assume that's how they are and that's how they have to be, and you get to try it differently.
Yeah, as we start wrapping up and coming to a close here, I'd like to just offer one more open-ended question. What really strikes both of you about Pat's story and how it's contributed to how we define authorizing today?
So I'm going to jump in and then I'll let Don back clean up. But I love Grand Valley. As Don said, I got my bachelor's degree in business there. I've got a son that just graduated in engineering, and I got a daughter, Lord willing, next year at this time, she'll be graduated as well. So I love the Lakers. But the backstory is, in order to make chartering politically acceptable at the time, they had a policy that they'd only charter within 75 miles of the university. And I used to tease Pat, how do you measure that? Is that by the way the crow flies or by your car? Anyway, Grand Valley State now is the largest university authorizer and the largest authorizer of charter schools in Michigan.
Yeah, Pat really did set us up for success in that. And part of that was the measured approach that he took up front of wanting to charter close to Grand Valley, wanting to charter within a drive of Grand Valley. Also, what you didn't hear in Pat's story is that he was very judicious in not chartering a lot of schools in one district. He didn't want to do anything that necessarily hurt a district that was doing really well. So he would charter one school in a geographic area in order to have a proof point. So it was a big deal for us when the university started authorizing in Detroit, well on the other side of the state, and in other areas that were farther reach. But I think that measured approach, the supportive approach that he took, really set us on the right path and is really a model for a lot of other university authorizers today.
And that's why there's the National Charter School Founders Library, to capture these stories, the oral histories, let people learn from the past. And one of the themes is that the idea of chartering has evolved over time. It expanded and it's grown. It's gotten proof points. It's had its struggles, but there have been people that care and there are people that have pioneered it forward. And the great thing is it's working for kids, because you have to remember this. There is no student in a charter school that's assigned. They are all there by choice.
As I listen to these early authorizing stories, I'm struck by something. The power of these leaders who are building something that had not existed before. And they're holding the line between the quality and the innovation and how to hold the schools accountable with very few tools. They were building their own tools as well. And I can only imagine that it must have been a little bit messy, a little bit political, but also a little bit invigorating. At its core, I see these leaders as true pioneers and a lot that we can learn from them because we all believe that families deserve these options, these opportunities.
Vashanta, there was a personality type there too, because you heard Patty went and talked to a couple friends, and the one was hostile, telling him not to do this. I got a similar story for a future podcast. But my point is, when you get charter folk that you tell them they can't do something, a lot of them personality-wise are going to show you they can. And that's part of Pat's story, and he did a great job.
That's true. Well, Jim, do you have a call for action for our listeners today?
I do. Be like Pat, be like Joe, be like Tom. Jump in, care, believe, keep the main thing, and really focus on how are we serving students? How are we measuring the progress of schools? And how do we believe and care? Because this is not just a job, it's a mission, it's a calling. Chartering is indeed a promise. It's a promise we prove together. Now that requires hard work, it requires thought, it requires discipline, it requires time. But you've got to be rooted in mission. You got to have courage. You got to have curiosity, and you got to have that can-do spirit.
Absolutely. Well, friends, in the next couple of episodes, we're going to take this authorizing thread a little bit further. We're going to look at how different states approached it and some lessons we can learn from the early years. Because authorizing at its best is much more than oversight. It's a custodianship, if you will, of the charter movement, and we all have a part to play. If this episode resonated with you, we certainly invite you to visit the Founders Library to dig deeper into the documents, the oral histories, the voices, and lessons that have shaped this work over time. So until next time, stay bold, stay mission-driven, and stay in your community. If you haven't already, please follow us, click subscribe, send us a message. Let us know how this season is resonating with you. We'll see you next time on the Bold by Choice podcast.